Hello, this is Chris from IELTSadvantage.com, and today we're going to talk a bit about IELTS speaking topics. This is a very common question that I get on the website about what are the common topics for IELTS speaking. So let's look at what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the common Part 1 topics. We're going to look at Part 2 and 3 topics. And then we're going to look at a better strategy than focusing on topics. Focusing on topics is okay, but there is a much better strategy for you to get higher grades, higher band scores in your IELTS speaking test. So let's look at an overview first if you're not familiar with the speaking test. In Part 1, you're going to be asked questions on familiar topics. So you'll be mostly asked about yourself. So this is just like a warm-up round really, where they ask you about your friends, about your family, maybe your hometown, things like that. Part 2 is more difficult than Part 1, and in Part 2 you will be given one topic on a piece of card, and they will ask you to talk about that for between 1 and 2 minutes. And then in Part 3 you'll be asked more difficult questions, more abstract questions about the topic in Part 2. So let's look at the common Part 1 topics. These are quite predictable. So you'll probably asked about your family. If you're working, you'll be asked about your job, and if you're at university, you'll be asked about your studies. You might also be asked about your hometown. Now, these are very, very familiar topics. Most students at a very low level will be able to talk about this. So this is the examiner's way of helping you relax and get into the test and become familiar with what's happening in the test. So they're not very difficult questions at all. It's kind of questions like how long have you been studying at university? How many people are in your family? Where is your hometown in your country? So even elementary students or lower intermediate students should be able to answer these questions. However, this doesn't mean that you should prepare scripted answers. Lots of students know that they're going to be asked about their family, or they know that they're going to be asked about their hometown, and they prepare very long, complex scripted answers. This is a very bad idea. Let's look at the reason why scripted answers are bad. So they sound very, very unnatural. And if you script your answers, it affects your fluency, it affects your pronunciation, and it affects the content. Let's think about the content, for example. If I asked you where you're from, a normal person would just give a 1, 2, 3 sentence answer. If you're giving a scripted answer, you might talk about the history of your hometown and the architecture of your hometown. That is very, very unnatural, and that is not the way a normal person would answer that question. So it's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is just answer these naturally. And you're not really impressing the examiner. So if you memorize a 6 or 7 sentence answer for tell me about your hometown, you're not impressing the examiner at all, because the examiner has maybe interviewed 100 people or 200 people, or some of the more experienced examiners might have interviewed 1,000 people, and they've seen this again and again and again. So they know when you have prepared your answer, when you scripted your answer. They know exactly what you're doing. You're not fooling them at all. And it can actually show how poor the rest of your answers are. So for example, if the examiner asks you about your hometown, about your family, and about your studies, and you give very prepared, very scripted answers, and the content of them is excellent, and then they ask you more complex questions in Part 3, say, and your answers are terrible, you're showing the examiner how bad your English actually is. So you can only talk about familiar topics. You can't talk about more complex topics, more unfamiliar topics. And that really is the difference between, say, someone who's getting a band 6 and someone who's getting a band 7. People who get a band 5 or band 6 have no problem talking about very familiar topics, but when you talk about more unfamiliar topics, they have big problems. So if you're giving very good answers in Part 1, scripted answers, and then bad answers in Part 3, you probably won't get over a 6. So let's look at Part 2 topics, some common topics for Part 2. So here is just a range of topics that I looked at about 30 or 40 past papers, recent past papers, and these were the different topics that came up. Now, you can probably see that there is no way that you can predict what the topic is. This is just a sample of the last, say, 40 or 50 part 2 topics that I know of, but these are not the common topics. There are no common topics for part 2. If someone tells you, or a website tells you, this topic comes up again and again, you should really prepare for this, don't believe them. You won't be able to predict the topic at all. And you would waste a huge amount of time preparing if you focused on topics. So what some people have done, what some students in my classes have done, is they have got a list of common topics for part 2, what they think are common topics, say 20 or 30, and they've tried to prepare answers for all of them. That would take a huge amount of time. And there's only one topic in part 2, so you've just wasted hours and hours of your time preparing for some things that probably won't come up. So the main lesson to take from this is part 2, you cannot predict what is going to come up. And the IELTS exam is an English exam. It's not a knowledge exam. Lots of students, when I say you can't predict the topic, they say to me that if I don't know anything about the topic, I won't be able to talk about it. You have to bear in mind that there are no marks for your knowledge of that topic. You don't get extra marks for being an expert, and you don't get fewer marks for knowing nothing about that topic. They are examining your English. And if we go back and look at these topics, sports, electronics, school, childhood, cooking, these are very basic topics. If you don't know anything, if you can't talk about your childhood, or you can't talk about electronics, or you can't talk about sports, then you shouldn't really be doing the test in the first place, because these are very, very easy things to talk about. And when Cambridge are making the exams, they pick topics that anyone in the world will be able to talk about. So it will be extremely rare for you to get a topic that you will know nothing about. You will be able to talk about it in some way, but they don't expect you to be an expert. So there's a better way than just memorizing lots of topics. There's a much better way. So let's use part 3 as an example. We're going to go on to part 3. So in part 3, instead of using topics to prepare for the test, we use functional language. Now, what is functional language? For example, one of the things that the examiners will want you to do is speculate about the future. For example, they might say, what do you think will happen with X in the future? What do you think will happen with sports or electronics or education in the future? So they're not really interested in what you have to say, if you know what I mean. They want to know that you're able to speculate about the future, that you're able to talk about the future, that you have that functional language. They don't really care too much about the content. They care about the grammar, about the functional language, if you can actually use that language. So let's look at other possible functional language that you will be asked to use in part 3. So you'll be asked to give your opinion. You'll be asked to evaluate another person's opinion. Talk about the future. We've discussed that already. Talk about cause, what causes something and what effect that might have. Talk about unreal situations, so hypothetical situations. Compare things and contrast things. And you'll also be asked to talk about the past. So the examiner will ask you questions and try and get you to use this functional language. This is what they're really, really interested in part 3. And as you'll see, there is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things. So it's much more important to be able to do these 7 things than to memorize lots of topics and lots of things from topics. If you can do these 7 things, you will be able to talk about any topic. As I've said before, the topics are always about things that anybody in the world could talk about. If you can use this functional language, the speaking exam will become much, much easier for you. So the conclusion from this video is, don't worry too much about topics, worry more about functional language. So if you want more information, just Google IELTS Advantage Speaking, click the first result, and you'll be taken to my speaking page. And on the speaking page, you will see that there is lots and lots of information about this functional language, and there's also a strategy for part 2 as well. So thank you very much. That's the end of the video, and if you want more information for hundreds of free articles on everything IELTS, just visit IELTSadvantage.com. All right, thank you very much. Goodbye.